Well, Dr. George Barna, thank you so much for being here today.
Lee, it's great to be here. Thanks.
Well, you have such a prolific career in researching trends in culture and in religion. Why did you embark on this path?
I think when I first got started, I was trying to figure out how could I add value to what was happening in the church, capital C, across the country at that time. And as I evaluated what different people were doing, what information was available, what information wasn't available, one of the things that occurred to me is there doesn't seem to be a lot of trend-oriented information that relates to the depth of people's faith. Gallup and others were already doing data related to how many people attend church, how many people bought a Bible last year, that kind of information. And I thought, well, if I'm a pastor, that's not really going to be terribly helpful to me. But knowing what people believe, why they believe it, what they do with it, how that could change, what's causing their views to change, all of that was something that I didn't see being done in the marketplace. So I thought, well, that would be a good thing to embark on. And that's pretty much been the focus.
So you've been at the forefront of worldview research, trends in the church for quite a while now. What are some of the biggest shifts that you've seen in recent years?
People have become more selfish. Churches have become less influential. Pastors have become less Bible-centric. Families have invested less of their time and energy in spiritual growth, particularly of their children. The media now influences the church more than the church influences the media, or the culture for that matter. And say the Christian body tends to get off track arguing about a lot of things that really don't matter.
How do we get to this place to where the church has seemed to have lost its way? There's not discipleship anymore. How did we get here?
Poor leadership, seminaries that mislead local churches into thinking that they're actually training individuals whom God has called to be leaders and are qualified to be leaders, then certifying them to lead. Local churches not knowing any better, bringing them on. And they're good people, and they have great intentions, but they're in the wrong position. They're set up to fail. Measuring the wrong things, you get what you measure. So if you measure the wrong things, you'll get the wrong outcomes. And I know from the research we do with pastors that there are 5 things that most of them measure consistently. Most of them believe, more than 4 out of 5 of them believe, that their church is effective in ministry. When we ask them, how do you know that? They say, well, we measure it. What do you measure? They measure 5 things. How many people show up, how much money they raise, how many programs they offer, how many staff persons they hire, how much square footage they built out. Jesus didn't die for any of that. So we're measuring the wrong stuff. Consequently, we get the wrong outcomes.
So how do we correct course?
If we were to go back to the Bible, I think we'd recognize, first of all, that the church, the local church, the institutional church as we've created it, is man-made. It's not in the scriptures. People coming together to worship God, yes, that's in the scriptures. People reading the Bible and talking together about it, yes, that's in the scriptures. People admonishing one another to be godly in their lifestyle, in their choices, yes, that's scriptural. But the programs, the titles, the buildings, all the stuff that has become sacrosanct in American culture and around the world for that matter, but especially here, it's not necessarily biblical. It's not necessarily unbiblical, but it cannot be the only way and the primary way that we invest our time, our money, our effort, our hope, our intelligence into in order to develop people. Jesus didn't come to build institutions. He came to build people. And we see that modeled in his life. And he devoted the ministry portion of his life to investing in individuals. And that's what each of us who are followers of Christ need to be doing, particularly with children. We make a huge mistake by simply using children as bait rather than as the primary focus of who we want to build up through whatever ministry impact or influence we can have. So I think if we were to go back and recognize it starts with families, parents have the primary responsibility to raise their children to become spiritual champions. Hence the book I wrote by that title, Raising Spiritual Champions. That's what we've got to be focused on. Local churches need to be supporting parents in that endeavor, and our primary focus needs to be children. And when we're focusing on children, as a discipleship practice, what we've got to be growing is their worldview. They need to have a biblical worldview because you do what you believe. And so your beliefs have to be right so that you can translate that into an appropriate lifestyle, one that honors, glorifies God, and advances his kingdom. You can't do that without a biblical worldview very effectively or very consistently. So we really have to focus on that. If we do that, we'll be able to grow the 3% of adults who are disciples in America today to a larger proportion.
How do parents practically do that? Raise children to be biblically literate, to have a biblical worldview in a culture that really presses against us constantly?
It's not as difficult as we think it is. There are a few things in studying children, studying parents, studying the parents who had raised spiritual champions, going back to those children who were raised that way, who grew up to be spiritual champions, talking with all of them, we found there are just a few things that have to happen. That doesn't mean they're easy, but it's possible to do. Number one, parents have to recognize their primary responsibility in life is to raise their child to be a spiritual champion. Second thing they've got to do is prioritize that in their life. Recognize that that's more important than anything else they do, and so make the commitment to that endeavor. Thirdly, identify what are the beliefs that I'm intentionally going to be sharing with and teaching my child, modeling for them, holding them accountable for. Fourthly, having a plan for how I can show my child and teach my child to translate those beliefs into behaviors. Fifthly, having a plan for how you're going to evaluate your child, hold them accountable. How are you going to do that? How often are you going to do that? And as part of that, inviting them to do the same thing with you. If you think you're a disciple, then you ought to be open to accountability as well from anybody who is aware of who a disciple is, what a disciple does, what a disciple believes. And so inviting your child into that process is yet another teaching moment that you can have with them.
That's really good. Now, AI is the hot topic these days, and I want to shift gears a little bit and get your opinion as somebody who observes trends in the world and how they impact the church. How are we going to see AI impact the church in the coming months, in the coming years?
Well, we're already seeing it impact sermons across the country, where many pastors, because they want to do well in some cases, because they're lazy in other cases, nevertheless, they're realizing AI is a means of getting perhaps a better sermon. And so we've got artificial intelligence writing sermons for Christians to hear now. There are other ways that we're going to see it impact us in terms of fundraising, in terms of media presence. I think as the body of Christ, we've got to be very suspicious of and careful about anything that even labels itself artificial. It's probably not good for our mental health, our physical health, our spiritual health. So I just encourage genuine leaders to be very cautious about inviting any of that into our lives, and particularly into how we're going to take that and then influence other people's lives.
But it's not going anywhere, and it is the future. So how do we approach it with discernment, teach our children to utilize AI if they need to, with discernment, with wisdom?
I think the same way that you do with any media platform. One of the things I talk about in the book for parents is media influences your children more than you do. So you can change that, but part of the way you change that is by getting involved in your child's media exposure. How do you do that? 4 M's. You've got to monitor it, know what it is that they're being exposed to. You've got to minimize it, put some limits on it. Thirdly, you've got to mediate it, get involved in what they're being exposed to, know the content, and fourthly, moralize it. Talk to them about it from a biblical point of view. Help them understand the media messages that are being sent to them, because they're worldview messages. And so it's up to a parent really to serve as the filter between that source of media and the information the child's being given. We are the gatekeepers. We're supposed to be the leaders in the child's life. Act like a leader. Take the lead, make the tough choices, and make those tough choices in relationship to the vision that you have for what it means to be a parent of a spiritual champion.
Yeah. So looking ahead, what are some areas or emerging trends that you believe are really crucial for the church, for believers to understand?
I'll tell you, just to me right now at this point in my life, having looked at trend after trend for decades, I'm focused on worldview development, helping children to develop into spiritual champions for the purpose of becoming cultural transformation agents. Understanding that's why we become disciples of Jesus, is to transform the culture he places us in. Those are the things I'm focused on. All the other stuff is noise. If we don't do those things, we're going to lose even more in this war. And so I don't mean to sidestep your question, but to me, the most important things, let's recognize if you're a disciple, if you're a parent, a grandparent, a teacher, a coach, a pastor, focus on discipling people. This is our moment. We've reached a time of Christian invisibility in our culture. And what I'm seeing now is that we're getting to this place where the typical American, when we look at their circle of friends and the people who have influence on them, that circle of influence, we're now about to enter that point where there will not be anyone in that circle of relationships or circle of influence who has a biblical worldview. And so you're not going to be influenced with God's truth. The consequence of that is then, as a culture, we'll then be at a place where the elites in our culture will have the opportunity to shut down spiritual freedom. And so we'll no longer be allowed to go to churches. We'll no longer be allowed to buy and read Bibles. We'll no longer be allowed to speak in public about our faith. Why? Because it all traces back to disciples not making disciples. So this is our moment. We either, put up or shut up. And I would suggest that we put up.
Dr. George Barna, thank you so much.
Thank you, Leah.